Hi, this is Justin Colletti. You may know me from Sonic Scoop, but today I am on the Plugin Alliance channel, and we are talking to the founder and product designer for one of the most exciting new brands under the Plugin Alliance umbrella, and that is Adapter Audio. We are talking to Marc Adamo at his studio in London in the UK. Marc, how are you today?
Hey, we're good. Thanks, Justin.
Great to have you here. In case you're not familiar, Marc so far has 3 plugins out. One of them, the first one he put out with Plugin Alliance, was the Adapter Audio Metric AB, which was a plugin that allowed people to do level-matched A-Bing inside their own DAW with some of the best workflow for A-Bing that you've ever used. It's gone to become one of the most popular plugins in the Plugin Alliance family. He followed that up with the Adapter Audio Streamliner. It does a variety of things, allows you to check loudness levels, allows you to listen through the kinds of codecs that your music will be put through on streaming services and the like, and he has just come out with his latest, a dynamics processing plugin called Sculpt for mixing and mastering, and it does a lot more than just compression. This one's particularly interesting, and we'll talk about that in some detail. Before we get into that, I just want to ask you some basic broad questions, Marc. What unites all of the plugins that you've done for Adapter Audio so far? Is there something that ties all these tools together in your mind?
Well, I'd say it's really kind of pain points turned into elegant workflow. That's the main thing is, with Metric AB, it was, okay, we want to AB tracks, but there's no nice way of doing this. How do we get this inside the door where it's super convenient? You get instant AB rather than the time lag, which messes with your perception, auditory skills. How do we put that in? And what other things can we put with it just to make it that much better, much more useful, pairing it with analyzers, loudness matching, and all the convenient stuff that's in Metric AB. So that was really kind of the groundwork for design and workflow basis in there. With Streamliner, again, it was like, it's a pain point. How does my music sound like on streaming platforms? What's going to happen to it? A lot of questions that people ask themselves and are unsure of until it finally gets onto the streaming platforms. So it's a case of, again, how can we get that kind of referencing and make it as convenient, simple as possible? People are always asking, what kind of codecs does this one use? What's the loudness normalization on that platform? And instead of having to look up all those bits of data and try and piece it together, it's just like Spotify, Pro Level, mobile, it's all done for you. And, why should musicians have to go and research these things all the time when really all they need to do is know the result? So that was kind of the pain that we tried to alleviate with these plugins. I guess with Sculpt, we're kind of getting into slightly new territory where we're actually processing audio for the first time. Because, with Metric and Streamliner, it's not really there for processing and being creative and enhancing your signals. But Sculpt is something new.
Yeah. Now, before we dive too much deeper into Sculpt, I just want, for people who aren't too familiar with either the Metric AB or the Streamliner yet, what is the value of Metric AB? People can do some referencing against reference tracks in their own DAW already by just dragging tracks in and listening to them through their DAW. How is the Metric AB enhancing that process for them?
Well, yeah, it's a good point because, many producers came to me and said, well, I don't need Metric AB. I can do it this way. I can do it that way. And I'd be like, okay, tell me your way. And they go, well, I can just drop it in Ableton. And I'd say, okay, so when you're looping at bar 57, is your track that you're referencing at the right point? And they go, no, I have to move the playhead over here. And I go, well, Metric AB, you can put it wherever you want. And they'd say, yeah, but I don't need to do that. I can do loudness matching with my volume fader. Yeah, but you've got to sit there, look at meters, do it by ear. You can just press a button and get it done. What happens when you've got more than one track? Are you going to lay out 16 tracks in your DAW and do all this stuff? And A-Bing, it doesn't really work in a lot of DAWs. It might be simple in, say, Ableton, but then you still got the thing with the cues and the loops. So it's like all the convenience factor there for you. You don't really have to kind of convince yourself that this is okay, I'll get by, I can do it, I don't need Metric AB. You don't need Metric AB, but if you have it, you'll be thankful. It'll save you a lot of time, and you get all the convenience of all the analyzers and all the rest of it with it. So I love it.
Yeah. I don't really know anyone who's used it who doesn't love it and doesn't now use it for all the referencing. It really does take something that, yeah, you can do without the plugin, but makes it so much more seamless and enjoyable and just allows you to stay in creative flow more easily instead of constantly thinking of little workarounds. So another question on Streamliner before we get into Sculpt, and that one I want to talk about in some detail because this is so fresh, so new, and so different from, I think, other dynamics processors out there. But for people who haven't used Streamliner yet, what's the big value add there? It's telling me the loudness of my tracks. I get that. Why is that important to me? What kind of level targets do you think I should be shooting for? And what's the benefit of listening through some of these streaming codecs that you can do with Streamliner?
Okay, so the real impetus for creating Streamliner was I was reading stuff on the internet when, streaming became the main big thing. You had, let's call it bad production advice from certain people saying,
I think I know that website. I've been there many times.
you should always master your tracks to -14 because this is the level they're going to be played on Spotify. There's no point. We've won the loudness war. Everything should be -14. And I was like, nah. I come from a dance music background. -14 would be like playing your music at half volume compared to Skrillex. And to me, the loudness thing isn't about matching targets. It's about the feel, the density that it brings your track. There's no drum and bass at -14. That's like reaching -5 and ridiculous levels like that. So what it really was A, to show people that you should always master your tracks to what sounds good. And to help people understand this, it's like, let's give you something that shows you how much your music will be normalized if, and only if, people are using loudness normalization as an option on Spotify. Because some people don't. Some people leave it off and the tracks get played at full volume. And then who's going to look stupid mastering a track to -14 because that's what Spotify plays back? Well, it doesn't necessarily. So it's like, okay, let's give you some tools that show you what could happen, and then you can make your own decisions about how good your mastering and mixing should sound. And then it's all in your hands again. It's your creative decision. You don't have to listen to bad production advice from people who don't know your music.
Yeah, there's some good points in there. There is this assumption that some people make that all music is going to sound better if more dynamic range is put back into it. But there's a sound of a lot of genres that come as a byproduct of getting loudness. You use the word density, which I really like. The tonal envelope of things change when engineers are doing the kinds of things they're supposed to do to get that kind of loudness. And it even is the kind of EQing you're encouraged to do. Because if you load way too much low into a record and try to get to -6 or -5, it's going to sound awful. So it encourages you to make the kinds of decisions that are standard decisions made in those genres. And then you get to hear them through these codecs to see if these codecs are messing things up. And I have found that those people, even in genres outside of, dance and EDM, people in pop music genres and rock genres, when they have mastered to -14 and then heard their music on streaming services, they were very disappointed to find out that although audio volume normalization helps, it's not perfect and does not 100% level the playing field in perceived loudness in the end.
Well, that's exactly the point. And, if you look at the presets for the levels in Streamliner, we analyze music in all kinds of genres, from acoustic, folk, rock, old school, 60s, 70s stuff, as well as all the latest hyper loud stuff. And you'll see there's like jazz music in there that's, -7, and you kind of go, well, that's what's happening now. If you take the full master and you look at it, people are going for what the sound and the density and how forward, these levels bring us, rather than any sort of, pointless, I'm trying to fit into the Spotify loudness normalization zone. And what we really wanted to do was, like, if we're going for this stuff, let's put some really good metering in there. Instead of just going, hey, here's your I, S, and M, integrated short-term momentary loudness stuff, let's show you the PSR. And with the PSR, that's where you get the dynamic range of music and you feel the density. We developed a little thing in there because usually you might get a histogram, but we created this little sort of 8-second window to show you what the average level of your music is in the last 8 seconds. And this is kind of really like a perceptual thing that humans have to say how you interpret the feeling of the dynamic range. And this gives you a much better kind of, let's say, average of what's happening than a single thing that's constantly fluctuating. Your eyes can't really read something if it's moving fast. So having like a bar that's gradually averaging over 8 seconds gives you a much better instant visual understanding of what your music's doing.
Right, and it's much more relevant often than an integrated LUFS reading, which would take the entire track and try to get you an average from there. Now, for those who don't know, PSR, what does that acronym stand for?
Peak to short-term loudness. So it kind of originated from crest, which was your peak to RMS. But once the loudness standard kicked in, the loudness measurement takes your volume, but actually looks at the frequency range of what frequencies are thought to be louder perceptually to people, human hearing, and gives those a different weighting to the frequencies that the brain doesn't feel like are as loud. So it's literally just substituting RMS for short-term loudness instead.
Right. And we could go down a deep rabbit hole here. Whenever you're comparing peak to loudness, it's loudness over how long, and then there's a difference between simple RMS and a weighted loudness curve like you're discussing. But I think that is fodder for an even nerdier conversation for some other day. Right now, the thing I want to nerd about with you, Marc Adamo, is your latest plugin, which is Sculpt. So let's talk about this new third iteration in your line. What is Sculpt? What does it do? It's not quite a compressor, although it has compressors built into it, both upwards and downwards, which is an interesting concept we can talk about. Give me the quick elevator pitch first on what is Sculpt, why do I need it, what does it do, and then we'll go a little deeper.
Okay, so Sculpt is what we call a dynamic sculpting tool. We can't just call it a compressor because it has more than just compression on it. It's fundamentally all the kind of dynamic sculpting things you might use: expansion, compression, transient design, and a brand new thing we call tonal sculpting, which we'll have to nerd about a bit in a minute. Put them all together in a module. It's a broadband thing. It's not a multi-band thing or anything like that. Put that all together, create a workflow that makes it really simple and easy to use all these things to shape your sound and control dynamics, expand dynamics, play with dynamic structure, texture, rhythm. That happens when you use these processes.
All right. And before we go even deeper into all those other processes, let's talk about the one thing that a lot of us already understand, which is compression, which a lot of us understand to some degree. You have both downward compression and upward compression. Can you explain the difference and the potential benefit in using the less common of those two?
Okay, so the less common is upwards compression, right? Are we agreed on that?
Absolutely. My goodness, there's so few of them ever designed.
All right, so as we know, downwards compression brings the peaks down. So essentially your sound is going to get less spiky, so to speak, and more controlled from that angle. So the loudest bits become quiet. With upwards compression, we look at the quietest bits and bring them up, so they kind of come towards the peak. Now this kind of is almost a bit like limiting in a sense that you increase the perceived volume of the sound. You'll find the quietest bits, bring them up, and approaching compression in this manner, where you can go downwards and upwards, is potentially more, gives you more creative freedom than just thinking, oh, this needs compression, let's put it down. That's not quite working the way I want it to. What's really missing? Why is it not getting louder? That kind of thing. So when you can approach it from both ends, then you can find just the right balance of what you need to do, because you might need to go, yeah, some of these transients are a bit hard, let's bring them down. But also the quiet bits, I'm not getting enough detail out of the sound. So let's use the upwards compression to bring that up. And then you kind of create a more average, smoother sound between the highs and the lows. And you can bring that and clamp it in, vice grip it in as much as you like.
Right. And with Sculpt, it's not just about using one or the other. You can use those two modes together, both bringing down the peaks and bringing up the lower levels.
Absolutely. So Sculpt's essentially designed around 4 dynamics modules. You've got your upwards compression module, your downwards compression, your tone sculpting, and your transient. Now, these modules aren't in series. There's not the audio going through one to the other to the other. So it's not like a sequential process. What you've got is your audio comes in. You have these 4 modules that kind of work in parallel. The audio isn't processed through all 4 modules and then summed at the end. What it does is it analyzes the audio from all 4, looks at what your parameter settings are doing, calculates the gain change for each one, and then goes, let's add it up. final gain change. This is all we're doing. One single broadband gain change for all 4 modules.
Wow, very interesting. It's almost like the detector circuits are running in parallel, but not the processing itself.
Exactly. Exactly. And the detector circuit is really important because this is like a real kind of new thing that we designed here to be, envelope detection is kind of like the weak point of most compressors, or the character point of most compressors. So Theo, our developer, was really studying this and looking for how to make this much more fast, how to make this fast and distortion free, and how to really operate on a sample by sample basis to get the fastest possible reaction. And this was his goal, and we think he's done it.
Wonderful. All right, so 2 of these we now understand. The idea of traditional downward compression, we're taking the loudest peaks, bringing them down so the whole signal can come up. This less conventional idea of upward compression, where we're taking the quietest stuff and bringing that stuff up. Then there are these 2 other modules in there, one of which is more of a tonal sculpting and one which is more of a transient module. Can you tell us how those 2 work and what makes them valuable?
Okay, let's look at the transient thing itself. Again, it's all based on this new envelope detection circuit, which essentially, doesn't garble things. It's really good at detecting what a transient actually is. And because it can work on a sample by sample basis, you can really just enhance just what you want in the mix. It's not going to kind of mistake a more sustained sound and try and bring that up. Here's something you can do at home. Take Nirvana's Smells Like Teen Spirit, put it on, get the transient control, just the one knob, turn it up. It'll sound like the drums are just getting louder in the mix. Because if you know that track, everything is hyper compressed and the drums are the only thing with a little bit of spike on it. You turn that up, you'll feel the drum bus just rising. And so that's the accuracy that this transient processor can do. And there's a few extra little controls. You can extend it a little bit, but it's trying to keep it as natural as possible. So you can't make bad things happen with this. And you can soften it a bit if you want as well, go in the opposite direction. And also you can use like the emphasis EQ section. And this is something that's available for every single module, is like a sidechain EQ for the compressors and an EQ emphasis with the transient and the tone sculpting module, where you use an EQ-like interface to tell Sculpt which frequencies to pay attention to more than others. So if you take the high shelf on the transients and really bring those up, it's going to pay attention to those and enhance those more so than the low frequencies.
Interesting. All right, so we've got these 3 modules. What's our 4th one and what's important there?
Okay, so tone sculpting. Now this is like a little thing that needs a little bit of demystifying. It's essentially, it looks at your incoming audio, analyzes the tonal balance of the frequency spectrum, and you use this EQ-like interface, which has a tilt to tilt the bass and the treble, so you can rebalance that. It's got a parametric, so you can pick out a particular spot in the mix, and high shelf and low shelf. Now, say you turned up the high shelf a bit. What you're looking to do is tell Sculpt, when these high frequencies come into the mix, I'd like you to make them louder. But when there's no high frequencies, it won't really do much. So Sculpt, you're kind of telling Sculpt, when you hear these frequencies, make them a bit louder. Or if you did the opposite, took it down the high shelf, when it hears those high frequencies, it'll drop the volume a little bit. And it's very cunning how it does this. And like I said before, it's like a sample by sample basis because of this super fast envelope. And also this long look ahead that really allows it to analyze all the frequencies to really understand how, changing the gain on a sample by sample basis is going to affect the incoming audio. So it's really trying to balance it properly. And, we thought a best way of describing it is you've got essentially an intelligent, super fast gain riding robot that can move the fader so fast, but we weren't going to call the plugin super fast gain riding robot. We just couldn't fit it on the display.
I don't know. If you do a standalone with just the Sculpt, I think you have your name. It's a pretty good one. So this is interesting. It sounds to me like it's a little bit like a dynamic EQ with an improved detector circuit. Is that an oversimplified way of describing it? Does it have a somewhat similar end result or somewhat similar applications that you'd like to use it in, like you might a dynamic EQ, or is that overly simplified?
Yeah, I would say a dynamic EQ will get you different results because it's not quite the same process as a dynamic EQ. In fact, the idea behind this Tone Sculpt module is based on how a compressor interacts with sidechain EQ. So, if you use, say, sidechain EQ on a downwards compressor, you've got, say, a big 808 drum loop with the big booming bass. If you just try and apply a broadband EQ on that, when the bass kicks in, it's going to crush the volume levels. You get that big, and then, the snares disappear and everything. So essentially, most people get a high pass filter, bring it up, and then the compressor doesn't react as much to the kick drum when it comes in, and you kind of do that, and it changes the tonal balance of the spectrum. But in order to do that kind of stuff, change the tonal balance, you have to really start working the compressors quite hard, and then you deal with the compression results, let's call them artifacts or processing. So in mastering, one of the things that mastering engineers will do with sidechain EQ is try and rebalance the spectrum a bit. But like we said, in order to do that, you have to really start working the amount of compression and live with the results. So the idea of tone sculpting is, let's see if we can change the tonal balance a little bit, but without having to introduce massive amounts of compression to do it. Let's make it sound as natural as possible. So that was the aim of the module, just to kind of do that stuff. But how it differs from EQ is, if you just raise the high shelf or EQ on a typical sound, then it's always going to have that plus 5 dBs of high end. With a tone sculpt, it won't really add anything unless there's the material there to boost it.
Right. So you're only increasing those targeted frequencies when there's a reason to do it rather than having an effect on the overall signal. So one last thing I wanted to talk about with you here is the auto gain feature, which I think is more robust in Sculpt than in most other dynamics plugins. Can you tell us a little bit more about what's going on there?
Yeah, well, we've talked about the sound of Sculpt. The other side of it, the workflow, we think we've got a really big workflow enhancer here. The auto gain system we've developed, we think it's the most advanced auto gain system of any dynamics plugin. Now, one of the main pain points about using compressors is, every time you tweak a knob on there, the volume changes up and down, and you kind of it's hard to measure exactly what compression is doing. So with this auto gain system, you just analyze the audio for a few seconds, and then once that's done, every knob, every parameter on Sculpt is calibrated to keep your output volume consistent with your input volume. So all you're really getting to hear is the sound of compression at work. So this gives you a much better understanding of how your material is being affected by Sculpt, free of any loudness interference and distractions. Now, the other aspect of the auto gain system, which is really cool, is all the presets are calibrated. So when you're smashing through the presets, usually you're kind of set back by the threshold. You're constantly having to adjust the threshold to compensate for how the preset was designed in the first place. Now with auto gain, because we have analyzed your audio, the threshold is automatically calibrated to your material and the preset. So you can smash through the presets and every one of them will be in the ballpark. So you will hear the sound of the preset as it's intended. And that is a big workflow enhancer in my books, when you just get to hear purely the sound of compression. Now, if you're there thinking, what if I want to make my audio louder? Well, there is makeup gain, manual makeup gain on every compressor in Sculpt. So you can do what you like, but it's there, it's great, try it.
Wow, so that is more than just auto gain. This is like an auto threshold too. And this is the first that I've really heard of that happening in a plugin. I really like this idea, and it sounds so obvious now that you're saying it. Why this isn't more widespread, I have no idea. All right, so very cool. To recap, we've got 4 modules. We've got downward compression controlling peaks, upward compression bringing up the quiet parts. We've got the transient control, which would be transient envelope shaping, independent of compression. And one of the great things there is sometimes people use compression and limiting to reshape envelopes. But the problem is if you have very dynamic material, then you could be really affecting the envelope in one section and not affecting it all in a quieter section. So you get to do that in a much stabler, more stable way. And then we also have this tonal sculpt, which is interesting. I don't know what the one sentence re-encapsulation of this idea is, but the closest that I'm thinking of is something like frequency dependent gain control, something along those lines. Do you have a tagline for what Sculpt is?
Well, I would say try it. Try it and see for yourself.
Well, that's a pretty good tagline. And if anyone wants to do that, the best place to do it is over at plugin-alliance.com, where you can try out any of these adapter audio plugins or anything Plugin Alliance makes for free for 2 weeks. Or if you are a user of the Mega subscription bundle, this new Sculpt tool is now just another tool that is part of your subscription bundle at no added cost. So go and check this out for yourself. That's absolutely the best way to use it. We want to hear from you in the comments down below. Have you used Sculpt or any of these other adapter audio tools? Where have they excelled for you? What do you think are some of the greatest benefits? Do you have any questions about them? Let us know in the comments down below. We'll be checking those out. Now, Marc, question for you, last one, which is, what's the future for adapter audio? I know it's not quite a one-man shop, but you're a small boutique plugin company making specific designs that are based on the pains that you've experienced as a producer and an engineer and a mixer. Do you have any future development ideas? What's next for you guys?
So I guess the most important thing to tell people is if you've got Metric AB and you've got Streamliner, there are updates coming this year, all right? If you want the M1 compatibility, it's coming. If you're a Metric AB user, I know that the most requested feature is, can we make the UI resizable? So yes, that is happening. There's a bunch of other stuff as well. You know, we've talked about some of these things online in the forum. So rest assured, I'm pretty sure you'll be happy with the update for that. Streamliner, we got some cool things for that as well. Lots of user requests, more platforms. We're going to make it so you can just have the metering open to do your mix work with, and then the codec section can pop out when you need that. Some other refinements, you know, lots of little things like that. So that's coming this year, guaranteed. As far as the future is concerned, the most exciting thing for me is, you know, new innovations in DSP. And this is really where I'm looking to connect up with any DSP gurus out there who have some, you know, exciting new thing that we could turn into a plugin, you know, just from the raw juice of it. Like what happened with Sculpt. You know, Theo brought me this really interesting algorithm and prototype that was just a bunch of knobs and parameters on the screen. And it's like, let's turn that into something that's just beautiful to use for people. And that's kind of where we're at with stuff.
Well, wonderful. I've got to say that is one thing that brings all the adapter audio plugins together so far in my experience, is that they're immediately intuitive and easy to use and fun to look at. And that's something that's important when you're staring at a screen, working with audio all day, for the controls to just make sense to you and just to be a pleasure to work with, and absolutely great designs on that front. And this is the first one where we're doing real audio processing, and it's sounding good is also another big feature of Sculpt. So Marc, thanks again so much for taking the time to talk today. Thanks for designing these super cool plugins. I use your first two plugins all the time, and I'm just starting to play around with Sculpt and have been really impressed just in this past little bit of trying it out. So really excited again to hear what you guys think. Let us know in the comments down below how you've been enjoying these plugins. Thanks for hanging out with us. This has been Justin Colletti of Sonic Scoop, this time on the Plugin Alliance channel with Marc Adamo from Adapter Audio. Thank you for joining us, Marc.
Thanks, Justin. It's been real fun chatting with you, and hope to hear what you think of Sculpt soon.
Thank you, Marc. Thank you guys for hanging out with us. See you next time.